Us, welcome. We are going to kick off in just a sec, but if you could just type something in the chat so we know who's here and we know what audience we need to sort of be thinking about. Trina, the little timer said that we started about a minute ago.
Okay.
Oh, yay, Kenneth says hello, so that's great. Awesome.
Tara, I'm going to do an audio check as well. Can you all hear me?
I can hear
Can they
you.
hear me? Can you hear me? Okay, perfect. Well, if you're ready, I'll be ready to start.
Yep, why don't we kick it off just for time's sake, and then as folks join us, we can continue on with the conversation. It'll leave time for some dialogue at the end.
Absolutely. So happy afternoon or early evening for many of you all, depending on your time zone. We want to welcome you back to the conference session. And our session today is titled The New Normal, School Leadership and the HR Lens. Today I have Carol Bauer. I'll let her introduce herself, and then I'll introduce myself secondly. Carol?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here. My name is Carol Bauer. I'm the Executive Director of Girls Athletic Leadership Schools of Denver. So we are charters within Denver Public Schools, and we have a middle school 6th through 8th grade and a high school 9th through 12th grade that are technically two schools, but we share a campus, and we have a lot of shared. We operate a little bit more like a 612. So that is who I am, and happy to be here today. I've been in this position for almost 5 years, and I have been in nonprofit and school leadership for close to 30. So
Thank you, Carol. My name is Trina Mall. I am the Director of HR and Talent at the Colorado League of Charter Schools. So I wanted to welcome you all. I'm like Carol, we're excited to host this session. I'm going to go to the next slide and share with you all a poll that I'm not going to be able to launch, but I just want to give you a little bit of a context. We had a poll and we were going to ask you whether at your individual school, do you have a standalone HR staff or staff member? And the second question was, does your HR overlap with another position? So the reason why we were asking is because we will be talking today in our presentation from both lenses and both perspectives, so you will have context on that. Today, let's talk about what we will go into. We're going to review the importance of HR and school leadership and learn the top 10 HR items to know during COVID-19 era. And then last, we'll share a basic overview of recent laws that might affect you and your school. So let's start with what is HR about? HR is about people and policies, process, and compliance. Many people think HR is only about the compliance aspect, but as you can see, we always keep people in mind, and people matter, and so we build our policies, processes around that to be in compliance. So in that, I'm going to pass it over to Carol. And Carol, I'll let you talk a little bit more about what you think HR is about when we talk about the people, policy, process, and compliance. And then I'll come back.
Sure. Thanks, Trina. So as Trina and I were talking through this, there were a couple things that floated to the top for us around these two main areas of human resources. So the first being the people, and really the highlight here is the people of any organization, and especially of a school, are really your biggest asset. 100%. And so your job as an HR leader is really to take care of your people and value your people. That's like one half of what you should be spending your HR time on, at least. When we looked at the other side of HR and thought about the policy, the processes, and compliance related to human resources at a school level, there were two really big things that came up to the surface. One was to really make sure that you had effective HR practices in place. And the reason that you do this is, one, to support taking care of your people, but the second huge reason is to support the risk mitigation of your school, and that both can associate with you being able to be renewed with your authorizer to make sure that you're in compliance with your contract, as well as you being able following state, local, and federal laws around being an employer, and especially if you're a public employer, that as well.
Thank you, Carol. So let's talk about and get into our 10 things you need to know now. So our number one item that we're going to start with is know and take care of your people. As Carol just shared with you, people are our biggest asset, as well as they are the glue that really puts the organization, the school together. So by doing that is being mindful of the employee life cycle. So if you're not familiar with the employee life cycle, here are the stages of the employee life cycle. And so you have the stage of the what we call the attract me. That's that initial engagement from when you recruit an individual, and then we move to get me started. That's the onboarding, and then the development is the continuous along with performance management. How are you evaluating your team members? How are you giving them that feedback, that coaching that aligns with that development? Then we go into attract, engage, and motivate. So, what are you doing to engage your staff? In a previous session I was in earlier, we know that Gallup has shared the state of the U.S. workplace employee engagement as of last month was at 35%. So we see that we have areas of opportunity to continue to engage our staff members and our employees to help them be motivated as well. And we have seen challenges in motivation. We'll talk a little later about motivation in this COVID-19 era. And then we move into the next stage of the employee life cycle, which is recognition. How are you rewarding and recognizing your staff members? What are those, not the big things, some of the simple things that you're doing. So please feel free to put in the chat some of those areas of opportunity as well as strengths that you are doing right now when it comes to the employee life cycle. And then the last is what we call the wish me farewell, which is when your employee does leave your organization. And so what are those steps that you're doing? Are you looking at an employee that has left on their own? Maybe they had to relocate or other situations in life occurred, that you look at them as an ambassador and an ally to share your organizational culture and to share who you are as an organization and to continue to promote what you do. So just thinking about the employee life cycle. So again, people matter, and that is our number one. Let's go to number two, and I will let Carol take it away.
Sure. So the next thing we wanted to talk about, and we've all been in it together for the past 8 months, is that we are in a pandemic. And that means that we have needed to shift policies and protocols related to remote school, but also to remote work and the contracts that we have with our staff. Trina, if you could go to the next slide. So the one big thing that if you have not done this yet, or if you have, it may be time to renew it, thinking that we are going to be in a remote work option for a little bit longer, is to make sure that as part of your employee handbook or as a separate agreement that you have as part of your work agreement process, whether that's an addendum to a contract or an addendum to a work agreement, that you really explicitly outline what your expectations are for a remote working environment for your school staff. So things to include in that very explicitly are expectations of work, hours, and equipment. So making sure that staff know that if they have equipment that's been given by the school, that's what they should be using. They still shouldn't be using that to serve job sites in the middle of the day or whatever it is, et cetera. Hours, those are trickier, right? It used to be that your staff would show up at your building at 7:30 in the morning and you knew exactly what they were working on at all times. Making sure that those hours and breaking out hours with teaching hours and when you have expectations of them to be planning or in other staff meetings is also helpful. Something we added in our addendum in our remote learning agreement was an agreement to care for community. This came out of actually requests from the staff themselves that they wanted to see that if we were going to come back together in a hybrid model or for our remote learning support center, or if we were going to interact in any way, that we were taking care of ourselves. And so made an agreement to act safely and honestly in our personal lives as well as our professional lives for one another. That's just part of the culture that we have at my school. So it was something that was easy to add in there, but it's something that you might want to check in with your staff about. A big thing that we added in our remote work agreement was accommodations request. So I have had zero accommodation requests previous to us being in a pandemic. So I knew what it was. I knew that I had to comply with that, but I did not have a good system set up for that. We wrote out the system really explicitly. We created forms with the help of the Colorado League of Charter Schools to use for staff to request accommodations and then for us to review to get medical information, et cetera. So having that really explicit and really spelled out is very, very needed. The other thing that we added in addition to just our ADA accommodation requests was also a request for organizational accommodations. So we had some staff who they knew they didn't comply with ADA. They themselves did not have a disability, but they were somebody who either lived with somebody who was needed their care or was risk or immune deficient. We had a couple staff who were in charge of other family members logging on and being part of a remote school, and so asked to stay remote if they could. So we created a separate process for that had to be step by step and also equitable. Zoe just interrupted and said, do you have a template for the agreement to care for community? I can absolutely. It's just a short paragraph, Zoe, and I'll put that in the chat just as soon as we're done with this slide. I'm happy to share that. Other couple things that were in that remote work agreement. One is very explicitly sharing what eligibility was. So Americans with Disability Act is one federal law. We also had our governor in the state of Colorado put out a couple different executive orders that also allowed other folks that didn't fall under ADA to be able to qualify for accommodation in the pandemic. And so we really had to look through our state, district, and executive orders to make sure that everything that we put in our handbook was something that qualified for accommodation. Trina will talk about the FFCRA, the Families for something, Corona Relief Act, something, the Corona Relief Act family accommodations. She'll talk about that a little bit. We laid that out in there and also gave places for folks to go look. We also had a couple state laws that kind of dovetailed the CARES Act, Federal CARES Act. And so we laid those out in this addendum. And then the other thing that just really calmed the nerves of my staff was really going quarantine scenarios and making that explicit. And we did that in partnership with our district authorizer and also with other charters within Denver Public Schools. We kind of shared together what our best practices in quarantining to make sure people would stay safe if we were in a hybrid situation or an in-person situation and positive virus cases were coming into our school. And that was also extremely helpful for our staff to see and hear.
Thank you, Carol.
Yeah.
So next, our number 3 is what the law says, the old and the new. So we have FMLA, which is we'll say still the old, that many of us are very familiar with, the Family Medical Leave Act. And then we have the new that showed up in this time of COVID-19 era. We had the Emergency Family Medical Leave Act and the FFCRA, also known as Family First Coronavirus Response Act. So knowing what those two entailed. So just starting with the FMLA, it has not gone away and it will always be in effect in the law of the land. But we have the FFCRA that many of you know that was introduced to us back in early part of March, and that was effective as of April 1st. And it still is in effect through December 31st of this year. I will be honest, Carol knows I've said this repeatedly. I have no idea if the FFCRA is going to roll over into 2021. I like to believe, for the sake of what we're seeing nationwide with spikes and other situations that are going on with the cases, that this FFCRA will continue to go in effect. But what this did, as you're aware, it provided 80 hours to an employee for qualifying reasons. So know the qualifications and just be aware of the act and the qualifying reasons. Also, we had the FMLA, so the Emergency Medical FMLA that showed up as a result of COVID-19 as well. So again, knowing who qualifies and the qualifications are key, and also knowing what does it cover. Many times, Carol knows I've said this to the schools in the Colorado region that you could start with out with FFCRA. You could have a emergency medical family leave, and then it could go into FMLA and end up in ADA. So understand there is a layering, as Carol shared earlier, that having those policies and processes in place are key because all these different acts could layer on top of each other. And then I hate to give you all a headache, but you could also have workers' comp that could show up. So I'm sure when Carol and I talk to you at the end of our slides, we'll share. We've seen all show up, and we've had these discussions where someone has all of them: FMLA, FFCRA, the emergency, and then workers' comp, and then ADA. So knowing that that is something that could occur. Let's talk about the next one. Carol, I'm going to pass it back over to you.
Yeah, so one of the things that was really helpful with my sort of cohort of charter leaders here in Denver was to have conversations about what staff qualify for as around accommodations versus staff who are just feeling anxious and don't feel like they want to come to work. And so one of the things that we really worked on doing was creating a series of staff meetings where we kept sharing with staff the transparency of the data that we were looking at, of the laws that we were looking at, and of what we could and couldn't do as an organization. So we also really shared data around how we had about 75% of our families who were saying, I really want to come back as soon as I possibly can to be in an in-person learning scenario. And we had about 30% of our staff who were saying, I feel good about coming back. And those two things did not balance out, right? And I know, are seeing in the state of Colorado that some of our bigger school districts before our most recent spike in cases were having to close down because they frankly just didn't have enough staff to safely staff their schools. So that just creates an imbalance. So we had a lot of conversations about who qualifies ethically for a request for accommodation. So like I said, there is what qualifies under law, and we did create scenarios of we will do the best we can with what we can organizationally, but we also really asked staff to think about the jobs that they were in and that they were hired to do. So we did make sure that they knew and understood what an essential worker was, and that they actually fell under that label as a public school employee. For some folks, that didn't sit really well, and so we had some conversations around that. They felt like essential was equatable to expendable, but we did talk through some of that. Again, leaning on a lot of data about transmission in schools, that kind of thing. We did, again, talk about following requests for accommodations. We had a lot of staff who would talk a lot in staff meetings, but never filled out a request for an accommodation, even though we said that there was a process open outside of ADA. So I think just letting that time and just reinforcing that we'll do everything we can to care for you, but these are the parameters that we're going to fall within. The other thing that we did talk about was sick leave. And so we had some staff who were feeling like, I don't want to come in every day. I want to, and so just reminding them that they did have sick leave, they did have PTO that they could use for whatever reason. And then also we talked about sort of partnering to have a buddy system where people could feel that they could lean on other people if they had questions or anxieties about just working safely in a pandemic, because it was really scary. But that was something that initially when it showed up, I was like, oh my gosh, people like real, but I'm very pragmatic. So I get that that's how I approached it, but just making sure that like you really listen to your teammates and respond with what their needs are. So we did a number of things to do that. Thanks, Trina. Yeah, so this was a couple other things that we did. Yeah, so with my anxious staff, a couple other things that we implemented. One was we initially, through our school district, had testing that would happen, and it was only free once every 2 weeks. And I just lifted that, and I said that the organization would pay for testing as much as they wanted to get tested, just to take that barrier away and show that we cared. If you are anxious and want to get tested every day, every other day, we will pay for that. testing to happen. The second thing we did was really talk through a cadence of transparency. So we shared, here's when we're going to talk about what at staff meetings from now till the end of semester. I also started to do Carol checking in emails about, sometimes it was twice a week, sometimes it was once a week, about all of the information that I was getting from either our district or from our public health folks, just so I was sharing, not in a super in-depth level, but just at that level. And then I also created open forums with myself and some of our other school leaders if there were staff who wanted to drop in and ask questions or talk in person. I had a few of those times where I just sat and did my own work with nobody joining me in my little Zoom call. But I also had a few of those times where I had over a dozen staff show up because they really wanted to talk through things that were going on in the community. The last thing that I did, and this, I feel like this woman, her name is Melissa, is a unicorn, but we have a unique school in Denver that focuses on students who are fighting substance addictions. And so we have a school leader of a charter school who also has her is also a medical doctor, a physician, and she also has her master's in public health. So she is like this trifecta of information around how schools in public health world in a pandemic overlap with one another. So I actually asked her to come and present to my staff and share the data that she was looking at, the research that she was looking at, how she was making decisions for her own school. And that turned out to be an amazing, amazing time to spend. And she also said she's willing to do that for other charters out there in the world. So I'm happy to share her contact information if you need to. All right. Thanks, Trina.
Thank you. All right. So number 5, compensation and benefits. What do you need to know now? So, I put at the top, cash is not always king, but I will put the comma, and pandemic times it becomes king. So, I'm going to start with thinking about what are those intrinsic and extrinsic rewards that you can assist your staff with. Those things, intrinsic being those, areas of autonomy and empowerment and connectedness and belonging. And so thinking about what are some of the intrinsic rewards. We had a couple schools that shared with us that they actually had masks made with the school logo. They were giving their school, some schools previous to the COVID-19 era were not giving out logo clothes, logo wear as I call it. So thinking about, ways that you pride within the staff of just those kind of small ways that didn't really cost you anything because you already possibly had the logo clothing in stock. And then those intrinsic areas, whether it's you think about the things that might add in cash could be, giving some learning and development. And so from the learning and development could be you pay for a small, let's say for someone to attend this conference, but the intrinsic is for their share out in their learning and development to share out with your staff. So just looking at ways that you can do both. We also learn, and especially right now more than ever, the EAP, which many of you will already have overlapping within your health plan. And if you're not sure, check with your healthcare provider. Carol hears me say this often, use your vendors. You pay for them, use them to your benefit, but really promoting the employee assistance program. And that's what the EAP stands for. And so making sure your employees are well aware of that benefit, it's free, and the benefits that it offers. Also, health and wellness, just promoting that, getting up from, if they're in the remote setting, getting up often from their workstation and stretching and moving. I've learned a lot from Carol about the value of moving, as well as taking care of themselves through their own self-care. I know often there are schools in Colorado that have shared with their staff, and I'm sure Carol has some examples to share with us in the wellness of just, taking your own kind of social, emotional, mental wellness check, just having that step away. And what are you doing for self-care? And so even all of us on this call in this session, asking ourselves, what are we doing for our own self-care? Next is bonus. I just had a study that I just read that came out this month from the Society of Human Resource Management, and what they're sharing as more and more companies are going to end the year with. That's why cash it will be king, with some small bonus or some type of financial incentive to help people as we shift during these times. Where, many of us know we have budgetary constraints, but even in those small bonus, and bonus could be also in the form of a gift card or other compensation related ways that you want to give some small token of appreciation and recognition. And you can use that in the form of different various stipends as well. So just keep it in mind that cash is not always king. There are other things that you can do, but cash will definitely help during this time. So what's the key to compensation benefits is to know what's out there, to ask your staff, and then to do. So just keeping that in mind. Carol, do you want to share anything around the compensation benefits?
Sure. So we did a couple things. We were one of those places that we bought everybody a mask with our logo. We mailed them our staff T-shirts, which they usually pick up at school. We sent them DoorDash gift cards when we had conferences because we usually feed staff during conference days that happen in person. And we did actually give, at least our classroom teachers, we actually ended up, I think, giving most staff a little bit of a stipend to for the work that they were doing to translate their job from in-person to remote. For teachers, that was a lot of rewriting of curriculum and lesson plans, et cetera. For some of our leaders and operational people, it was like rewriting all of our policies and procedures, et cetera. So those were some things that we did, and we did ask for feedback on that as well, on what staff wanted.
Carol, I do have a question. I know I've heard of schools, and I don't know, were you one of these schools that did this, that you, for those teachers that were in the remote space, did you give what we call kind of an office setup stipend as well? I've heard of those.
Yeah, we did not because we didn't have a lot of cash. But what we did do is say, come to the building and take whatever furniture that you need to set up your home office. So we did have folks come in and especially like desk chairs, like that was
Yeah.
something that people didn't have. They didn't necessarily need a desk, but they also picked up the things that lift up your computer so you can stand if you want. We had teachers come in and get whiteboards, like rolling whiteboards that they could put behind them when they were teaching, if that was something where they wanted to use. So that was what we did.
Okay. Thank you for sharing. And I just wanted to, have you share because there are options that you have, especially if you're in that remote space, that you don't have to quote, you have a small budget or budgetary constraints. You don't have to necessarily use that money. You can have them come in and get those supplies that are already there. So thank you, Carol. All right.
Yeah.
Number six, staff adjustments. What we put all inclusive of furloughs, RFP, which is reduction in workforce, flexible work schedule, and the budget consideration. So let's talk a little bit about what that looks like. When you're thinking about a staff adjustment, the first thing is determine your why. Why do you need to make a staff adjustment, which is probably your budget considerations, which is driving that, and then the what to understand what do you have to furlough? Do you have to do a reduction in workforce? Is there some kind of flexible scheduling you can work on? Are there sabbaticals? There are a lot of creative ways. When we first went into the COVID-19 era, one of the first, and I think, Carol, you heard me say this oftentimes, that let's do whatever we can not to look at reduction of workforce, staff adjustment. I mean, there's furloughs, there's creative ways. So there were a lot of schools that looked at creative ways to look at making those staff adjustments. Next is have a process. What is that process that you made the determination on, let's say, for instance, on a furlough? And in that process, how will you communicate with those staff members that are being furloughed? And then know your law, know all the requirements that are required by you as an employer that you have to notify your employees. And then last, ensure there's equity and compliance. And so what do I mean by equity? Making sure that you have the ability for fairness, consistency, as well as ensuring that, and also in the equality, people are treated the same, but that people have what they need in the process to be successful. And then again, being in compliance, making sure that, your staff knows their medical provisions. They know about their health care benefits. They know their rights. They know about if you furlough or if you did a reduction in workforce, if that was what you determined, knowing unemployment processes and being able to help them through that time. So again, staff adjustments with budget considerations. So, number seven, equity and inclusion, and what we call in COVID and beyond, because equity and inclusion is always going to be part of what we do in our existence in our schools. So, I have this perspective of what I call diversity, equity, and inclusion matters plus Maslow. One of the things that I think we've seen in this era and time is where Maslow's hierarchies of needs really come into play. So when I think about the aspect of Maslow equated to equity, people have a lot of different definitions, and you might have your school's definition. But for the sake of our time, I want to share with you. Equity is giving people what they need to succeed, and so it's about that fairness aspect from your staff. So, what do your staff members need to succeed in the era of COVID-19? And how are you going to be equitable? Carol gave you several great examples of how she had the equity filter and a lot of the processes that we've shared thus far. The next is looking at inclusion. Are you being inclusive of all of your staff? Are you just talking to your educators and forgetting those staff members that are in your back offices, your business office, your administrative positioning? We had a situation where I had a call in some of my schools that asked, well, what about my custodial staff? They're full time. Do I need to include them on all the communication? Yes, that's inclusion. And then it equals to what Maslow, we know level three is about belonging. In this time of COVID-19 era, what we have really, found out and realized is people want the connection. They want to belong. And so again, Carol gave you examples on how she was very transparent. She pulled her people in, asked them questions, made them part of the process of decision making. And so just putting that filter of the equity, the inclusion that equal to the belonging. So again, just thinking it through that in equity, inclusion and COVID-19, it does matter and it's here to stay. Carol?
Great. So the next piece that I wanted to talk about is our compliance and autonomy. So really the big thing here was know your state and authorizer laws, waivers, and protocols. So when we stepped into this pandemic, GALS Denver is authorized by Denver Public Schools, so we're district authorized. And when we first went into the pandemic, the district asked all charter schools to stay in line with what DPS was doing. As we moved, and so that happened right in March, they said we need everybody to close down. We're also in a district facility, so that weighs into our decisions as well. Then when summer rolled around, very early on, DPS said all of our charter schools are going to stay in line with all of our district schools around how we are going to return to learning. So initially they said, we're going to come back in a hybrid model in the fall. Then they said, nope, we're going to come back 100% in person in the fall. And then they said, nope, we're going to come back 100% remote in the fall. Well, when they switched to that second one, it was late July. Denver was experiencing our second peak of COVID cases. And there's a very large number of charters that are authorized by DPS. And what happened was one of the bigger CMO charters that has multiple schools finally spoke up and said, actually, you know what, our lawyers are telling us we can do whatever we think is right. And you're saying we all have to come back 100% in person. And we're saying we don't think that that's the safest way to do it. So then it created this sort of like kerfuffle or conversation within Denver Public Schools around, wait, what do charters have autonomies over, especially during this pandemic? And what decisions can we make on our own? So what was good about that is that we gained back some autonomy, right? And we could make our own decision about what we thought was best for our students and families and staff. What was hard about that is that it became apparent that I needed to up my game as far as my public health knowledge and decision making. I did not have access to my county public health officials in the same way that the district did. So there kind of became a back and forth around how we were going to rectify that and really what data are we using and how. And so it can be a double-edged sword. For us, it was good. One of the things we did was say, wait a minute, like in the time where we felt like it wasn't congruent with what we wanted, we did go back and really went back to check our contract with our authorizer to say, what exactly does it say? Well, it didn't say anything about pandemics, about acts of God, about that kind of stuff. But that was something we could stand on, at least to ask questions, to say, hey, we are thinking something different. And the other thing that really helped with us is that there are some organizations who take a more adversive attack to their authorizer to say, well, we're not doing that because we can do whatever we want, etc. We actually just stayed in contact with our authorizer. They've been super supportive of us as a charter school, and just stayed in contact about, here are the questions we have, here are the things that we hope that you can ask on behalf of us. Here's, that kind of thing. And that relationship, I think, really helped to build some of the successfully get some of our needs met that we really needed met. The other thing that happened, however, was that the district started to create a lot of paperwork that was needed from charters who were diverging from what they were telling their district-run schools to do. So we were just diligent. We leaned into it. We did all the paperwork multiple times, and ended up being able to do what we wanted to do. We are operating a remote learning support center, so like an internet cafe that's primarily serving our IEP kids and our kids with social emotional disorders. And now successfully, and we hadn't been able to be in person at all, and district-run middle schools and high schools had not been able to be in person at all either. And then the last thing is, if you have a lawyer, please lean into them. They are going to give you some of the best advice that you can. Our lawyer is the one who was like, well, read your contract, Carol. And so read your facility use agreement. What does it exactly say? Because that's how you'll be able to create open doors to get what you need. But really understanding what you are compliant to and what autonomies you have has been really a cornerstone for us being successful during this time. Is this me?
Mm-hmm.
Trina? Yeah. So another top 10 things. This is really important. Please stay true to your school and to your culture. When we moved to all remote in March, so a little bit about GALS, we have a school model that is focused on physical well-being. So we do movement every day with our students, and we incorporate movement into our pedagogy. And we also have a school model that really focuses on what we call positive gender focus, where we have therapeutic counselors that are on staff. We have a core course that is focused on social emotional development of students. And we have a lot of cultural norms that are really meant to build community and create joy as part of a middle school and an adolescent growth experience. So when we needed to break with our community in March, it was heartbreaking for us. Being together is a very powerful thing for our school model. But it didn't even occur to us, actually, that we wouldn't continue to do all the things that we would normally do in a school year. So we still had movement every day. We still asked our students to come in dress code. So I still wear my dress code every day to my remote office in my loft. We continue to coach our teachers to be able to incorporate movement in their online pedagogy. We did not cancel our social emotional core class, which we call GALS Series or GALS Action. So that was still something that we prioritized. We also, from the very beginning, prioritized synchronous learning for our students. So it didn't even occur to us that we wouldn't do that. And so we kept getting all this feedback of like, oh my gosh, you're the only one that's doing that. This was back in the spring. But that relationship, we're such a relational school that we couldn't imagine not following that core part of our culture and our mission. Another example of something that we did is that we every year do a really competitive competition. We call it Galympics, the gals version of Olympics. And we recreated it. So it's usually a series of challenges that students do either individually or in teams. They work in their wellness squads to be competitive to one another. And we rewrote it. We recreated games and competitions and strategies that could be done online. And made sure that that was something that was still happening in our school. Our new sixth graders this year, even though we've been 100% remote, we continue to get feedback on how happy they are to be a part of GALS because of some of these pieces of our culture that we've been able to really work to have shine through, even through a Zoom setting or a remote setting. The final thing around staying true to our mission is really having tons and tons of touch points with our students and our families. So we've continued. I just last night had a lovely family social hour over Zoom. We still have our coffee with gals every morning to have touch points with families. And we've been doing a lot of very targeted outreach to families during this time to make sure that they have what they need on all levels of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So some families, we actually operate a little bit like a community center. We're supporting with rent and food. A lot of families we're supporting with mental health supports, social emotional supports, and then and from there. So, and then go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
This is me. Yeah. So the very final thing about how to survive in a pandemic connected to HR is that anything related to human resource, any decision that you're going to be making, you have to do it with staff voice. So I said this before, some of the initiatives that we made around being transparent about sharing a cadence of when we were going to be available to gather staff input. We've done staff surveys. That just are Google Forms. We've done targeted outreach to specific staff who replied on surveys that they were uncomfortable, that they were anxious, et cetera. And then the other thing that we did instead of, we've never presented or dictated, here's what we're going to do. We've always presented a plan and asked for feedback and incorporated that. So even though a decision, like a hard decision might have been made, in the what was going to happen, the how was always included staff voice, and as much as possible our voices from families and students and families as well. So, but I can't, if you're not communicating with your staff about what's happening in the world at least once a week, I would really suggest that you do that so your staff know and understand that you are on top of what's happening in the world and you want what's best for them and you're taking care of them.
Thank you, Carol.
Yeah, so this was just the visual that I used for kind of collecting the voices of our staff, reflecting and revising whatever it was that we were working on, and then bringing that, keeping that cycle open.
Thank you. And again, just being able to be mindful of that communication. So we're at the end, and we want to thank you. We're going to open up for question and answers and look at the chat, and I will then stop sharing our screen. But just a couple things to do. Keep in mind what we call the big 10 things we just shared with you, the 10 things you need to know now, keeping that in mind. Remember to include HR in the process. And so at the beginning, we asked you, did you have a standalone HR staff or you're as part of the school leadership? But just knowing that you have HR partners available to help you, feel free to reach out to Carol and I if you want to share learnings as well as any best practices. We're always able and willing to share. And then know that those that do have an HR standalone, that I think of anything that I would share in COVID-19 era, that school leadership in HR, we have really formed a strong partnership, and we realize how we rely on each other, and knowing that leadership and HR are partners. And so if that has been a different perspective in the past, then I would say COVID-19 era opened an opportunity for the partnership to not only form, but to be strengthened.